There is a city in the desert that should not exist. No river feeds it, no lake sustains it, no natural spring rises from its floor. It sits in a canyon of rose-red rock, surrounded on every side by some of the most merciless terrain on Earth. A landscape where summer temperatures crack 50 degrees Celsius, where rain falls perhaps once or twice a year, where the sun does not warm the Earth so much as punish it. And yet, at its height, more than 30,000 people lived there. Its markets handled the most valuable commodities in the ancient world. Its architecture rivaled anything being built in Rome or Alexandria. Its engineers had solved problems that the greatest civilizations of the age were still struggling with. Armies tried to conquer it. They failed. Empires tried to starve it. They couldn't. One of the greatest military commanders in history sent his legions against it. They came back broken, depleted, and humiliated, led astray through waterless wastes by a single desert guide who knew exactly what he was doing. This city was Petra, and the people who built it, who carved it from living rock, who coaxed water from stone, who turned the most inhospitable terrain on Earth into the crossroads of the ancient world, were the Nabataeans. You have probably never heard their name in a history class. Their kingdom does not appear in most standard histories of the ancient world. They left no great literature, no philosophical tradition, no military dynasty that rewrote the maps of continents. What they left was stranger and more enduring than any of those things. They left a city carved from a cliff, an alphabet that became Arabic, a water system so sophisticated that modern engineers study it, and a lesson written in sandstone and silence about what a civilization can achieve when it decides that intelligence is a more powerful weapon than force. This is their story, and it begins, as all desert stories do, with thirst. To understand the Nabataeans, you must first understand their desert, the region they inhabited, the vast broken terrain of northwestern Arabia, the Negev, and the southern Levant, is not desert in the way a child imagines it. It is not a smooth sea of golden dunes. It is harder than that, and stranger. It is a landscape of fractured sandstone plateaus sliced by deep wadis, dry riverbeds that can lie empty for years, and then, in a single afternoon of distant rainfall, carry walls of water 5 meters high that sweep away everything in their path. It is a landscape of wind-carved rock formations, of cliffs that glow red and orange and purple in the changing light, of silence so complete that your own heartbeat becomes audible. The ancient Greeks and Romans looked at this landscape and saw emptiness, worthlessness, a barrier between the civilized Mediterranean world and the distant, faintly mythical lands of Arabia and India. The Nabataeans looked at the same landscape and saw something else entirely. They saw a network of routes, a web of paths connecting the Mediterranean coast to the Red Sea, the Nile Valley to the Euphrates, the incense-producing lands of southern Arabia to the temples and markets of the north. They saw the places where flash floods concentrated enough moisture to sustain life. They saw the rock formations that could be carved into cisterns, the wadis that could be dammed, the gorges that could be sealed with terracotta pipe to carry water across distances that should have been impassable. They did not see an obstacle, they saw an opportunity. The Nabataeans' origins are debated among scholars. The first clear historical reference to them appears in Greek sources from the 4th century BCE, when the Macedonian general Antigonus, one of Alexander the Great's successors, sent 2 military expeditions to conquer them. Both failed. The accounts of those failures are illuminating. The Nabataeans, the Greek sources tell us, lived without houses, moving through the desert in ways that made them impossible to pin down. They had no wine, drinking instead a drink made from honey. They kept no agricultural land that could be seized and held as leverage. They were nomads, and nomads cannot be conquered by armies designed to capture cities and farmland. But they were not simply nomads. Even in this early period, the sources note that they were already involved in trade, specifically in the trade of bitumen from the Dead Sea, which was valuable throughout the ancient world as a sealant, a medicine, and an embalming substance. The Nabataeans were not wandering randomly. They were moving along routes, managing resources, building relationships. They were, from the very beginning, something the ancient world did not quite have a category for, a trading civilization embedded in a nomadic lifestyle, drawing power not from conquest but from connection. Within a century of those failed Macedonian expeditions, they had a capital city. Within 2 centuries, they had an empire. There is a moment that every visitor to Petra describes. You have walked for nearly a kilometer through the Sikh, a narrow gorge barely wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast, its sandstone walls rising 100 meters above you, blocking out the sky until you are walking in a corridor of shadow and stone. The gorge twists and turns, never allowing you to see more than a few meters ahead. And then it opens. 1 step, and the walls pull back. The light changes, and there, framed by the last curve of the gorge, filling your entire field of vision and carved directly into the face of a cliff of rose-red sandstone, is the treasury. 40 meters tall, carved with columns, pediments, goddesses, eagles, urns. Its surface weathered to 1,000 shades of pink and orange and gold in the afternoon light, a facade of extraordinary refinement and beauty executed in one of the most improbable locations imaginable. The Nabataeans called it something else. We do not know what. The name treasury, al-Khazne in Arabic, was given to it by Bedouin who believed a pharaoh had hidden his gold in the urn at its summit. Rifle shots aimed at that urn, trying to break it open, have left marks still visible today. There is no gold in the urn. There was never any gold in the urn. What the building is, most archaeologists believe, is a tomb, a royal tomb, probably built in the 1st century BCE for one of the Nabataean kings, perhaps Aretas III, who is known to have admired Hellenistic culture and modeled aspects of his court on the royal traditions of the Greek world. But it is not the only tomb in Petra. It is not even, by some measures, the grandest. Petra was a city of the dead as much as a city of the living. The cliffs surrounding the urban center, and that center was a real city, with paved streets, a colonnaded main avenue, a great temple, markets, bathhouses, and a theater that seated 3,000 people, are perforated with hundreds of tomb facades at every scale, from modest single-chamber niches, barely large enough for 1 person, to the great royal tombs of the eastern cliff face, whose facades rise 30 and 40 meters in intricate carved tiers. The urn tomb. The silk tomb, named for the extraordinary swirling patterns of its natural sandstone. The Corinthian tomb, its facade a direct quotation from the architectural language of the Roman world. The palace tomb, whose scale suggests a building designed to impress not just the dead, but the living who would stand before it for generations. Each tomb was a statement. The Nabataeans did not simply bury their dead, they commemorated them. The tomb facade was an interface between the living city and the world of the ancestors, a place where the family returned on feast days to eat a ritual meal in the outer chamber, maintaining the relationship between the living and the dead across time. The ancestors were not gone. They were present in the cliffs watching over the city, and the city they watched was extraordinary. At its height in the 1st century CE, Petra was home to perhaps 20 or 30,000 permanent residents, with many more passing through on any given day as part of the caravan trade. Its main street, The colonnaded street, following the line of a wadi that had been paved and regularized, was lined with shops, public buildings, and temples. A nymphaeum, a public fountain fed by the city's elaborate water system, stood at an important intersection, providing water for humans, animals, and the various industrial and domestic uses of a large urban center. The Qasr al-Bint, the palace of the pharaoh's daughter, another name given by later inhabitants who had forgotten the building's true purpose, was in fact the great temple of Petra, dedicated to the primary Nabataean deity, Dushara. Its walls still stand nearly 20 meters high in some places, testament to the quality of the Nabataean masonry. And beneath all of it, and beneath the streets and temples and markets and tombs, ran water. If you want to understand the Nabataeans, truly understand them, not just admire their tombs, you must understand their relationship with water, because water in the desert is not a convenience, it is not infrastructure. It is the fundamental condition of survival, and the Nabataeans, who chose to build their capital in a place without a river, without a spring of meaningful scale, without any of the natural water sources that every other great ancient city relied upon, the Nabataeans solved the water problem in a way that has no parallel in the ancient world. They did not find water, they made a water system. The rainfall in Petra is sporadic and intense, averaging perhaps 150 millimeters per year, falling mainly in sudden, violent storms that fill the wadis and gorges with flash floods that subside within hours. For most ancient peoples, this kind of rainfall was useless at best and dangerous at worst. A flash flood in a narrow gorge like the Sick could, and occasionally did, kill dozens of people in minutes. The Nabataeans saw it differently. They saw rainfall not as an event to be survived, but as a resource to be captured. Across the mountains and wadis surrounding Petra, they constructed an intricate network of channels, dams, and cisterns that intercepted rainwater wherever it fell and directed it towards storage. The channels were cut into rock faces at precise gradients, steep enough to keep water moving, shallow enough to prevent erosion. They ran for kilometers across the landscape, gathering water from a catchment area many times larger than the city itself. The dams were engineering works of considerable sophistication. Not rough piles of stone, but carefully designed structures with spillways that prevented overflow, foundations that resisted the force of flash floods, and dimensions calibrated to the specific hydraulic conditions of each wadi. The cisterns were carved into the bedrock itself. Vaulted chambers sealed with a lime plaster so fine and so hard that it remained waterproof for centuries. Some of these cisterns held hundreds of thousands of liters. Together, the cistern system of Petra stored enough water to sustain the city's population through a dry season of many months. And then there were the pipes. The discovery of Petra's terracotta pipe system was one of the most significant archaeological revelations of recent decades. Running from a spring at Ain Musa, the spring of Moses, located several kilometers from the city, a network of sealed ceramic pipes carried water to Petra along a route that required the pipes to navigate the twists and turns of this Sick gorge. The pipes were not simply laid in the ground. They were engineered to maintain a precise, controlled flow. The gradient carefully managed to prevent the water from flowing too fast, which would create pressure that could rupture the joints, or too slowly, which would allow sediment to accumulate. Maintenance niches were cut into the Sick walls at regular intervals, places where a worker could access the pipe to clear blockages or repair damage. Filter basins intercepted sediment before it could enter the distribution system. The pipes delivered water to Petra's public fountains, to its private houses, to its industrial areas. And the system was entirely gravity-fed. No pumps, no machinery, just the patient application of engineering intelligence to the problems of physics. Modern hydraulic engineers who have studied the Nabataean water system report something striking. In its fundamental design principles, the system is essentially correct, not primitive, not a rough approximation of what a more advanced civilization might have done. Correct. The Nabataeans understood hydraulics, they understood the behavior of water under pressure, they understood catchment mathematics and storage requirements and maintenance needs. They understood it 3,000 years ago in the middle of a desert without the tools of modern science. There is a lesson in this that goes beyond archaeology. The Nabataeans could have built their capital somewhere else. They could have chosen a site near a reliable water source, a river valley, a coastal plain, a lake, shore. Every other great ancient civilization did exactly that. They chose the desert canyon instead, and then they made the water come to them. This was not desperation, it was strategy. The canyon location gave them security. The narrow gorge of the Essek was a natural defensive bottleneck that made Petra almost impossible to take by force. The surrounding desert gave them the buffer zone that kept armies at a distance. The water system gave them the independence to sustain that security indefinitely. They chose difficulty because difficulty was their advantage. To understand the wealth of the Nabataeans, you must follow the smell, frankincense and myrrh. These are not merely pleasant scents. In the ancient world, they were among the most valuable commodities on earth. Frankincense, the resin of the boswellia tree, grown in the highlands of southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa, was burned in temples from Rome to Mesopotamia, from Egypt to Greece. Its smoke was the medium through which prayers reached the gods. Without it, no significant religious ceremony could be properly conducted. Myrrh, from the commiphora tree, was used in embalming, in medicine, in perfume. It was a component of the holy anointing oil described in the Hebrew scriptures. It was present at the birth of Christ according to the Gospel accounts, carried by the Magi as one of 3 gifts, an indication of its extraordinary value. The Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, calculated that the trade in frankincense and myrrh was draining hundreds of millions of sesterces per year from the Roman Empire eastward. It was one of the ancient world's great trade deficits. The emperors worried about it. The Nabataeans controlled the route that connected these aromatic resins to their markets. The Incense Road, the overland caravan route running from the production areas of southern Arabia northward through the Hejaz, through Nabataean territory, and onward to the Mediterranean ports and markets, passed through the heart of the Nabataean Kingdom. And the Nabataeans taxed it, not brutally, not in the manner of an occupying power extracting tribute by force. The Nabataeans were sophisticated enough to understand that a caravan route is a living thing. If the taxes are too heavy, the merchants find other routes and the revenue disappears. They taxed reasonably, and in exchange for those taxes, they provided something that the merchants valued even more than low rates: security. The Nabataeans maintained the wells and cisterns along the route. They provided guides who knew the terrain and the weather. They offered caravanserais, way stations where caravans could rest, water their animals, and resupply. They guaranteed safe passage through their territory in a region where, without their protection, a caravan carrying frankincense worth a fortune might be robbed and destroyed within a day's journey of its destination. The Incense Road was not just a route through Nabataean territory, it was a Nabataean product. The infrastructure of the route, the wells, the way stations, the security, the guidance, was what the Nabataeans were really selling. The transit fees were payment for a service, and the service was genuinely valuable, genuinely difficult to provide, and genuinely unavailable anywhere else. The Nabataean cities along the route reflected this wealth. Oboda, today called Avdat, in the Negev highlands of modern Israel, was a Nabataean city perched on a plateau commanding views across the desert in every direction. Its ruins include temples, a bathhouse, cave dwellings carved into the rock, and extraordinary evidence of agricultural terracing. The Nabataeans had developed techniques for farming in the Negev desert, using runoff agriculture, capturing the occasional rainfall and directing it to cultivated fields, growing grapes and other crops in a landscape that appeared incapable of supporting them. Oboda's wine was known in the Roman world, Nabataean wine from the Negev desert, produced in conditions that should have made viticulture impossible. The Nabataeans again had decided that impossibility was merely an engineering problem. Of all the Nabataean kings, one stands above the rest. Aretas IV, whose full royal name was Aretas, lover of his people, reigned for nearly 50 years, from approximately 9 BCE to 40 CE. His reign coincided with the height of Nabataean power and prosperity. His face appears on more coins than any other Nabataean ruler. His name appears in more inscriptions. His building program transformed Petra and the other cities of the kingdom. He was also, by the standards of the ancient world, a genuinely unusual figure. The designation lover of his people was not merely ceremonial flattery, it appears consistently on his coinage and inscriptions in a way that suggests it was central to how he wished to be understood. Ancient Near Eastern kings were typically styled as conquerors, as divine representatives, as warriors. Aretas styled himself as a servant of his subject. This was not weakness, it was political intelligence. The Nabataean kingdom was not a conventional monarchy, it was a commercial enterprise as much as a political state, and its subjects, the merchants, caravan leaders, craftsmen, and farmers whose activity generated the kingdom's wealth, had real leverage. They could, if sufficiently dissatisfied, redirect their trade through other routes, settle in other territories, transfer their allegiances to other powers. Aretas understood this. He governed accordingly. His coinage is also remarkable in another way. It depicts two figures, a king and a queen of approximately equal size facing each other. The queen's name appears beside her image. This was extraordinary. No other Hellenistic or Near Eastern kingdom produced coinage that gave the queen equal visual prominence to the king. In the Nabataean world, women were not ornamental. They were partners. Nabataean inscriptions from across the kingdom confirm this. Women owned property in their own names. Women commissioned tombs for themselves, for their children, for their descendants, without requiring male intermediaries. Women appear as parties to legal contracts, as business principals, as individuals with economic agency and legal standing. The civilization that built Petra was also, by the standards of the ancient world, one of the most gender-equitable societies of its age. Aretas IV's reign also placed the Nabataeans at the intersection of some of the most dramatic events of the 1st century. His daughter, Phasael, was married to Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, son of Herod the Great. The marriage was a diplomatic alliance, sealing the relationship between the Nabataean kingdom and the Roman client state of Judea. But Herod Antipas fell in love with his niece, Herodias, and decided to divorce Phasael to marry her. When Phasael received word of what was coming, she did not wait passively for her humiliation. She requested permission to visit a Nabataean fortress on the pretext of pleasure, and from there escaped to her father. Aretas, insulted by the treatment of his daughter, eventually went to war with Herod. His forces won a decisive victory, and only Roman intervention prevented the complete destruction of Herod's power. It was in this context that John the Baptist had publicly condemned Herod's divorce and remarriage as unlawful. And it was this condemnation, by some accounts more than any other factor, that led to the Baptists' imprisonment and eventual beheading. The Nabataean divorce entanglement had contributed in its own indirect way to one of the most famous executions in history. The Nabataeans left behind something less visible than their tombs, less dramatic than their water systems, but perhaps more consequential than either. They left behind their script. The Nabataean alphabet was developed from Aramaic, the common administrative language of the ancient Near East, sometime in the 2nd or 1st century BCE. It was written from right to left as Semitic scripts are, and it was used to record the Nabataean language on everything from royal monuments to commercial receipts, from tomb inscriptions to graffiti scratched onto rocks along caravan routes. In its earliest form, the Nabataean script was clear and somewhat angular, descended recognizably from Aramaic. But over centuries, as the script was used more and more rapidly, the letter forms changed. They rounded, they flowed. Adjacent letters began to connect to each other in continuous strokes rather than being written as separate units. The script was evolving. By the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, the period after the Nabataean Kingdom had been absorbed into the Roman Empire, the script had developed a flowing cursive character that scholars of Arabic recognize immediately. The Arabic script is the descendant of Nabataean script. Today, Arabic is written by over 420 million people as a native language. It is the language of the Quran, the sacred text of 1.8 billion Muslims. The letters with which it is written, the elegant, flowing, connected forms that cover the pages of Arabic manuscripts, the tiles of mosques, the screens of phones across the world, trace their ancestry in a direct, unbroken line back to the merchants and scribes of the Nabataean Kingdom. The Nabataeans left no great literature. Their own language is only partially understood. They wrote primarily in Aramaic for formal purposes, and their native tongue is preserved mainly in names, loanwords, and fragmentary documents. They left no philosophy, no epic poetry, no historical chronicles comparable to those of Greece or Rome. But they left the alphabet. The letters you are reading, the letters in which so much of human thought has been preserved and transmitted. If you read Arabic or Persian or Urdu or any of the many other languages written in Arabic script, you are using a tool whose ultimate ancestor was developed in the sandstone canyons of northwestern Arabia by traders and scribes who needed an efficient way to record their transactions. Every letter an inheritance, every page a memorial. 500 kilometers south of Petra, in the northwestern corner of what is today the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the landscape changes character. The rose-red sandstone of the Jordanian highlands gives way to great isolated outcrops of rock. Dark, weather-sculpted formations rising from the desert floor like the ruins of an ancient architecture far older than any human civilization. The sky is enormous, the silence is absolute. This is Hegra. The Nabataeans called it Hegra. The Arabic name today is Alula. And in the sides of those great sandstone outcrops, the Nabataeans carved something that Petra itself, for all its magnificence, cannot quite match in terms of sheer preserved completeness. They carved tombs, more than 100 of them, their facades cut directly into the cliff faces, their interiors preserved by the dry desert air for 2,000 years. Where the tombs of Petra have been eroded and weathered and plundered across the centuries, the tombs of Hegra sit in a desert so remote that they were largely inaccessible to the outside world until the construction of the Hejaz Railway in the early 20th century. They waited. The desert kept them. The facades of Hegra's tombs display a fascinating vocabulary of architectural forms, Nabataean crow-step battlements at the top, classical columns and pilasters on the face, Egyptian-derived cavetto cornices framing the doorways. This is not confusion or inconsistency, it is deliberate cosmopolitanism. The Nabataeans lived at the intersection of cultures. Egyptian forms came north along the Red Sea trade route. Greek and Roman forms came from the Mediterranean. Arabian forms came from the indigenous traditions of the Hejaz. The Nabataean architect did not need to choose between them. He used all of them, synthesizing a visual language that was distinctly his own, recognizably Nabataean, unmistakable to anyone who has seen it before. The tomb inscriptions of Hegra are among the most valuable documents in Nabataean archaeology. Many are remarkably detailed, recording the name of the tomb's owner, the date of its construction, and precise legal provisions governing its use. Some of these inscriptions reveal something unexpected about Nabataean society: the prominent role of women. One of the most famous inscriptions is that of Hinat, a woman who lived around 60 CE. The inscription cut into the facade of her tomb identifies her as the daughter of Wabu and records that she commissioned the tomb herself. For herself, her children, and her descendants. Hinat was not an anomaly. Other inscriptions from Hegra record women as tomb owners, as legal principals, as individuals whose property rights were recognized and protected by formal inscription in stone. Recent archaeological work at Hegra, Alula has become a major focus of Saudi archaeological investment in the 21st century, has begun to reveal the settlement associated with the tombs, the city that supported this extraordinary necropolis, the markets, the houses, the wells. And in one of the excavated tombs, archaeologists found the nearly intact skeleton of a woman. Using the techniques of modern forensic anthropology, researchers were able to reconstruct her face. They could tell you her approximate age, her health, the physical stresses her body had endured across her lifetime. They cannot tell you her name, but they gave her a face. 2,000 years collapsed in the moment that face was revealed. The face of a Nabataean woman looking back from across the desert and the centuries, as present and as specific as the person sitting next to you. The Nabataean Kingdom survived by being useful to the powers around it. It was a buffer, a facilitator, a node in a network, rather than a military threat to any empire. But the relationship with Rome required constant navigation. When Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE and the Roman world descended into civil war, the Nabataeans found themselves enmeshed in the drama of the most famous love story in ancient history. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, had allied herself with Mark Antony, and she wanted more than political alliance. She wanted resources, she wanted territory, and she asked Antony for a gift, the Nabataean Kingdom, or at least its most valuable coastal territories along the Red Sea. Antony, besotted and politically embattled, gave her a concession, a portion of the Nabataean Red Sea coast. The Nabataean king was furious. He had been a reliable ally, had maintained the peace, had facilitated trade, and he had been given away as a gift to an Egyptian queen. The Nabataean response was subtle. When the Battle of Actium went against Antony in 31 BCE, and Cleopatra attempted to move her fleet into the Red Sea, planning perhaps an escape to the east, the Nabataeans burned her ships where they lay in harbour. Whether this was military action, political opportunism, or revenge for the territorial insult, the effect was the same. Cleopatra's escape route was closed. Her last strategic option was gone. Within a year, she was dead. The Nabataeans had, with a single act of selective violence, helped seal the fate of the most famous woman in the ancient world. Their dealings with Rome continued to be complex. The Emperor Augustus, newly master of the Roman world after Actium, was interested in the wealth of Arabia Felix, southern Arabia, the source of the frankincense trade, and he launched a military expedition under his general Aelius Gallus to conquer it. To reach southern Arabia, the Roman forces needed to travel through or alongside Nabataean territory. A Nabataean guide was provided. His name was Silaus. He was a senior official in the Nabataean court, a man of considerable intelligence and political ambition, and he led the Roman army into disaster. The route Silaus chose was not the direct route. It was an extended route through terrain that was difficult, through areas where water was scarce, through conditions that the Roman soldiers, equipped and trained for European warfare, were entirely unprepared for. The expedition that set out with 10,000 soldiers came back with a fraction of that number. Disease, thirst, and the relentless attrition of desert travel had done what no enemy army had needed to do. The Roman historian Strabo, who recorded the account, seems to have understood what happened. He notes that Silaus had betrayed the expedition. Whether this was a deliberate policy of the Nabataean state or the individual initiative of an ambitious official remains unclear. What is clear is the result. Rome's attempt to conquer the sources of the incense trade failed completely. The Nabataeans continued to control the incense road. The frankincense and myrrh continued to flow through their territory. The transit fees continued to fill the treasury at Petra. The desert had protected them again, this time with a guide rather than a canyon. The Nabataeans were not irreligious. They were, like all ancient peoples, deeply embedded in a relationship with the divine. But their relationship with the divine had a character that set them apart from their neighbors. The primary deity of the Nabataean world was Dushara, whose name means, roughly, he of the Shara, referring to the mountain range that dominated the landscape around Petra. Dushara was a god of the mountain, of the sun, of life and fertility, a powerful, somewhat abstract deity whose most characteristic representation was not an anthropomorphic statue, but a simple block of dark stone. This is striking. In a world where every other Mediterranean religion represented its gods in human form, where the Greeks carved their deities in marble with muscles and expressions, where the Egyptians depicted their gods with animal heads and human bodies, the Nabataeans worshipped a stone. Not entirely without figuration, Dushara appears in some contexts with human features, particularly in later periods when Hellenistic influence was strong. But the core representation, the betel or sacred stone, remained the most authentic and widespread form. The djinn blocks of Petra, massive cubic stone monuments that rise along the path approaching the Siku, are among the most ancient manifestations of this tradition. 30 or 40 of them, some several meters tall, carved from the natural rock formations of the site. They were not tombs, not administrative buildings, not engineering works. They were the presence of the divine made permanent in stone. Dushara's consort was Al-Uzza, a goddess associated with the morning star, with water, with strength. She was one of the three great goddesses of Arabia, and her worship connected the Nabataeans to the broader religious world of the Arabian Peninsula. There was also Alat, goddess of the sun and the divine feminine principle, and Manat, goddess of fate and time. Students of early Islamic history will recognize these names. They appear in the Quran in a verse that acknowledges their ancient status as the daughters of God, a designation firmly rejected by Islamic theology. But the fact that they appear at all is testimony to how deep their roots ran in Arabian religious culture. The goddesses of the Nabataeans were not forgotten when their kingdom fell. They persisted in the religious memory of Arabia for 6 centuries after Petra was absorbed into the Roman Empire. The Nabataean religious landscape was also characteristically sophisticated about water. Springs, wells, and cisterns were sacred spaces, places where the divine presence was felt and where offerings were made. In a desert civilization, the point where water emerged from rock was not just practical, it was miraculous, and miracles deserve reverence. For most of the 1st century CE, the Nabataean Kingdom maintained its independence within the Roman sphere of influence. It was a client state, technically sovereign, practically constrained by Roman power. Its kings were recognized by Rome, its trade flows were essential to the Roman economy, and its military capacity, while real, was understood by everyone to be inadequate against the full force of a Roman army. The question was not whether Rome would absorb the Nabataean Kingdom. The question was when and how. The answer came in 106 CE under the Emperor Trajan. The last Nabataean king, Rabble II, died without a successor capable of maintaining the kingdom's independence. The circumstances are murky in the sources. There may have been internal conflict, there may have been a negotiated transfer of power, there may have been Roman military pressure that the historical record does not fully capture. What happened next is clear. Rome created a new province, Arabia Petrea, from the territory of the former Nabataean Kingdom. Petra became a provincial city. The Nabataean administrative class was gradually absorbed into Roman provincial government. Latin and Greek replaced Nabataean Aramaic as the languages of official life. A new road, the Via Nova Traiana, Trajan's new road, was constructed across the former Nabataean territory, integrating it fully into the Roman communication and military network. This was not violent conquest, it was administrative absorption. The difference matters. The Nabataean people did not disappear in 106 CE. Their cities continued to function, their trade continued to flow, their craftsmen continued to work. Petra remained a significant city for another 3 centuries. The temples were maintained, the water system was extended, the population continued to live and die and carve tombs in the cliffs. What ended was independence, and gradually what followed was assimilation. The Nabataean language retreated into rural and domestic use. The distinctive Nabataean pottery tradition, one of the most recognizable in the ancient world for its extraordinary thinness and the delicacy of its painted decoration, reddish vessels with flowers and vines, so fine they appear to have been painted with a single hair, gradually blended into the broader Roman ceramic tradition. The Nabataean gods were given Roman identities. Dushara became equated with Dionysus, the god of wine. Al-Uzza was identified with Venus. The god survived in Roman dress. And then, in 363 CE, a massive earthquake struck the region. The damage to Petra was catastrophic. The water system, the precise, engineered network of channels and pipes and cisterns, was severely disrupted. Without the water system, the city could not sustain its population. The population began to decline. The trade routes had already shifted, partly by sea and partly through the newly powerful cities of Syria and Mesopotamia. The desert, patient as always, began to reclaim what the Nabataeans had taken from it. By the 7th century CE, when the Islamic conquest swept through the former Roman and Byzantine provinces of the Levant, Petra was still inhabited, but as a small settlement, a ghost of what it had been. The great tombs were already being used as housing, as chapels, as storage rooms by populations who had largely forgotten who had made them and why. The Nabataeans had become a memory, and then for more than 1,000 years they became less than that. They became a mystery. In 1812, a young Swiss explorer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt was traveling through the Arab world in disguise, calling himself Ibrahim ibn Abdallah, having converted to Islam and learned Arabic sufficiently well to pass, at least superficially, as a Muslim scholar. He had heard rumors of a great ruined city hidden in the mountains of the Wadi Musa, the Valley of Moses, in what is today southern Jordan. The local Bedouin tribes knew about it, of course. They lived among its ruins, grazed their flocks in its valleys, used its carved chambers as shelters and storerooms. But no European had seen it in modern times. Burckhardt told his guide he wished to make an offering at the tomb of the prophet Aaron, whose traditional burial site was located in the mountains above the ruined city. It was a plausible enough excuse to enter the area. He walked through the SIQ. He saw the treasury. He could not stay long. His interest would have aroused suspicion, and the tribes controlling access to the site did not welcome strangers. He made notes, made mental maps, and left. His published account electrified Europe, a rose-red city carved from cliffs hidden in a canyon, inhabited by time and silence and Bedouin goats. The expeditions followed quickly. The drawings, the photographs, the excavations, the slow, painstaking work of reconstruction. Not physical reconstruction, but intellectual. The work of understanding who these people were, how they lived, what they believed. That work continues today. The Royal Commission for Al-Ula, the Saudi governmental body established to develop and study the Hegra site, has brought international archaeological teams to the region in the 21st century. New excavations, new technologies, LiDAR surveys revealing the extent of the settlement around the carved tombs, chemical analysis of food, residues from vessels in the tombs, reconstructing the diet of people who lived 2,000 years ago, DNA analysis of skeletal remains, potentially connecting the ancient Nabataeans to modern populations of the Arabian Peninsula. The Nabataeans are being recovered, piece by piece, from the silence. There is a quality of light in the desert that does not exist anywhere else. In the late afternoon, when the sun is low and the shadows of the rock formations stretch long across the sand, the sandstone cliffs of Petra and Hegra glow with a color that has no name in English. It is between red and gold and orange and pink, and it changes every minute as the sun descends, cycling through shades that the eye can barely track. The Nabataeans chose this place. They saw this light every day of their lives. They built their most sacred spaces, the tombs, the temples, the facades carved into the cliffs, to face the west, to receive this light in the hours before darkness. They were not simply practical people, they were people who understood beauty. They were people who understood that water in a desert is a form of miracle, that trade conducted honestly creates more wealth than conquest, that a civilization built on intelligence and connection and engineering can outlast armies and empires. They were desert people, but they were also city builders, script inventors, hydraulic engineers, diplomats, artists. They were the people who, when confronted with impossibility, sat down with the terrain and the rainfall and the mathematics and worked out how to make the impossible merely difficult. And then they did the difficult thing. Every letter of Arabic script carries their fingerprints. Every time a negotiator chooses diplomacy over war, something of the Nabataean spirit is present. Every water engineer who studies how to make arid land productive is, in some sense, sitting in the tradition of the people who built the cisterns of Petra. The desert keeps its secrets slowly. Year by year, the archaeologists recover more. Year by year, the picture becomes clearer. The faces become more distinct. The voices become less faint. Hinat is looking back at us from 2,000 years away, her reconstructed face carrying the particular expression of someone who has been waiting a long time to be seen. The camel bells have been silent for 20 centuries. The incense smoke is gone. The channels that carried water through the Sikh are dry now, the terracotta pipes cracked and scattered. But the rock remains. The rose-red cliffs remain. And cut into them, permanent as anything the ancient world produced, are the tombs and temples and niches and inscriptions of a people who decided that the desert was not an obstacle. It was a home. Rest now. The desert is patient. The stars above Petra are the same stars the Nabataeans watched, and somewhere in the silence between them, the caravans are still moving. Good night.